Carice Whitty runs the Signal Group, a China-focused think tank based in Israel. We are recording this on the morning of October 10th, Tuesday, U.S. time. Carice, so where are you now, and what's your experience of the past few days been?
It's very hard to convey the depth of horror and pain that I, my family, and my country have experienced over the last few days. The last time so many Jews were killed in one day was the Holocaust. We are devastated. We are torn to pieces. I personally am torn to pieces. Um, and we are hearing more and more stories of utter deprivation carried out by Hamas against against children, against mothers, against grandmothers, soldiers. An entire base of women who worked in intelligence was mowed down. A bunch of 20-year-old girls. My daughter was in a base just like that 3 years ago. And she said to me, "Mom, that could have been me. We were not prepared for having a physical attack. None of us were trained to shoot. We had nothing. So they were just sitting ducks because Israel never expected this kind of invasion. We have no strategic depth in Israel. When I would host Chinese experts, Chinese policy advisors, government officials, etc., in Israel, I would take them around the country and have them walk to the border and see we have no strategic depth. The minute you cross our border, we are there. There's no buffer zone. So Israel has worked religiously to keep the violence and the attacks on our country on the other side. And this was a failure. This was a straight out failure. And we have gone from Saturday morning shock the entire day, just feeling like you're getting punched in the stomach over and over and over. And then we got past that first day, and now we're told we need to prepare our safe room for a potential attack by Hezbollah in the north with 150,000 missiles pointed at us. And some of these are precision missiles, and they will, it's not a hole in the building like you might have seen in Tel Aviv or part of a house. This is a complete wipeout if it comes from the north. And in this case, there's expectation that there will be hundreds of thousands of casualties. So we are preparing our safe room, and we're told we have to put cash. And, you assume water and dry goods, that's what they said, but also cash and your ID. I mean, I guess so that your ID doesn't get destroyed. So afterwards, if you can walk out of there, we can know who you are, or they'll know who you were when they pull you out of the, I don't know. I really don't know. It's so hard to fathom. We're just not completely prepared. Although I do have to say we're not unprepared. I do remember that over the past few years, sort of during COVID, we were reminded by the military that we need to do this kind of preparation. We will need to do it. And here the day has come. So where am I? I'm preparing the safe room. I'm trying to focus on work. I'm trying to help my kids who are all adults, but still suffering through this. And, and they in turn, are doing volunteer work, to try to help anyone that they can in order to get through this in one piece and hopefully come out of it stronger and with a very new Middle East.
So let's talk about the sort of, I guess, Chinese interpretation of the events over the weekend, which apparently are like America's fault. I'm curious for your sort of diagnosis of, what were some sort of geostrategic drivers of the attacks.
Well, the Chinese interpretation, first of all, I've been in touch with scores of government and party policy advisors, experts, academics over the last few days, and every single one of them on a one-on-one basis has offered heartfelt support standing with Israel, supporting the people, etc. The government has interpreted this. It comes across in a very similar way to the way China has interpreted past terror attacks. And it is bizarre to say, but even we woke up and said, "Oh, this it's another terror. Is it another terror attack?" And oh no, this is not just another terror attack. I mean, can you believe those words that I'm saying? That terror attacks are our norm. Oh yeah, it's just another terror attack. So China's response has always been generally to take the Palestinian side. Politically, China officially stands 100% with the Palestinians and has done so, um, for decades. On an economic level, China is very happy to work with Israel on a personal level, on a cultural level, many interactions, academic cooperation, scientific cooperation, et cetera, et cetera. But politically, they've always been very clear 100% anti Israel votes in every international institution. Uh, when I said this on CGTN, I was criticized by a Chinese scholar that this was too harsh, that I was too sharp. And my response is this is not the time for uh, concern about Israeli harshness and sharpness. This is a time where history will judge the decisions that are made by countries around the world. And we see, you know, Brussels generally is not a great supporter of Israel. It generally is a critic of Israel, but they firmly stand with Israel right now. The butchery that took place, no human, no humane person could watch that and say that this is anything but barbaric and stand with the people who are suffering. Many Chinese people, I understand, are getting a lot of misinformation and disinformation, which is common. But it means that the government and the censorship is allowing that misinformation to become rampant on and Weibo and other social media, which is causing a misreading, and it's making it look like once again the Palestinians are suffering from Israeli aggression. Well, this began with the most egregious and savage, barbaric behavior against citizens, civilians. And the next step is very much that Israel is going to have to respond. And I ask the Chinese leadership if a country near China entered across the border and murdered an equal percentage of people and captured an equal percentage of people, of Chinese, and took them into their territory as hostages, what would China do? China, we have seen China's response to any kind of modest, and I will say modest terror. There is terror and there is terror. A car bomb in Tiananmen totally transformed China's approach. And what we've experienced, what Israel has experienced throughout the years has been horrific, but it doesn't compare to what we went through on Saturday, which is Simchat Torah. It's a day of joy. The holiday happens to be my birthday. And instead, this day will always be associated with tragedy, and a tragedy of enormous proportions. So China's interpretation is very much seen through the lens, from what I can tell, of the standard competition with the United States, the fear of U.S. strength and its ability to cultivate strong alliances. And therefore, that rhetoric is guiding the interpretation of what has happened here And that is in itself tragic because it will lead China to miscalculations on policy steps in this region. The Middle East, we all know, has become very important to China. It has actually accurately identified the Middle East as sort of the weak link between between Europe and the Indo-Pacific. China has focused very much on investment in the Middle East, bringing Middle East countries into its orbit. We know that 4 of the 6 countries that were brought into BRICS are Middle East countries, including Saudi Arabia and Iran, which is, I believe, part of um, the wind in Iran's sails was becoming more of a recognized uh, player on the international stage. I also think that the U.S. Releasing at least $6 billion to Iran, which is fungible, even if that money is only for humanitarian, frees up a lot of other money for Iran to use to back Hamas. We know that Hamas had many delegations visit Iran over the past many months, and it's clearly training, guidance, and masterminding of Iran behind this attack. Hamas wa- uh, was backed by Iran and guided by Iran, and when we look to who is at the core of this, it is a country that is working closely with China. And China is aware of Iran's threats to eviscerate Israel. And the first statement that Xi Jinping comes out with is to create an answer to this attack. A Palestinian state must be created alongside a Jewish state. And I want to ask, what in this event on Saturday indicates that there is an interest in a Palestinian state alongside a Jewish state? There is nothing in that attack that would lead to a kind of compromise. And anybody who thinks that that was an effort for anything less than the entire territory of Israel is kidding themselves. First of all, Hamas does not represent the Palestinian people or the Palestinian Authority. Hamas has been running its own territory for years. There was no reason for them to be interested in Israel at all. But their goal and their charter states they will take the entire land and turn it into an Islamic state. And that is what the murderous efforts that took place on Saturday are meant to lead toward. Iran has orchestrated a multi-level, multifaceted plan where it starts with Hamas, draws Israel on foot into Gaza, and at that point, there's an agreement that Hezbollah will begin to attack from the north, while we have many of our military uh, uh, capabilities focused on the west in Gaza. At that time, there are also uh, Iranian militias made up of Taliban and Houthis in Iraq and Syria who can infiltrate from the north. They can then open up 2 more fronts, which is the Palestinians in Judea and Samaria, which some people refer to as the West Bank. And the final front are Israeli Arabs. And we saw some of that take place in the recent past. But in the end, this 4 or 5 point attack is not about convincing Israel to make concessions. If Israel thought that concessions would lead to a peace and a live and let live situation, we would have done it years ago. Ehud Barak offered Arafat, with the support of Clinton, more than 100% of the territory that has been discussed in these 2-state solutions for decades. And he said no, flat out no. He said, I will not be the Arab leader who gives away our sacred land. Well, what sacred land is he talking about if he was already getting 100% of the territory discussed?
Let's take a step back and talk a little bit about the sort of China's moves in the Middle East over the past year or two. You've seen a lot of coverage of them sort of husbanding this rapprochement between Iran and Saudi Arabia, which looks a little interesting in retrospect. But I'm curious, sort of what you think the broader motivation was for all of that, and where China will stand, when the dust starts to settle on whatever is going to happen over the next few months.
So first of all, we have to keep in mind what we said at the outset, or what you noted so rightly, that it looks like it's all about America from the perspective of China. So, as I noted, the Middle East is this weak link. China has been the largest investor in the Middle East since 2016. The digital Silk Road has been very successful here. The investment um, uh, by China into Middle East countries that can provide payment through oil, et cetera, has grown exponentially. I think the third largest BRI investment country a couple of years ago was Iraq, because they can pay for whatever they need in oil. We know that there's a huge amount of Chinese technology. Huawei has blanketed most of the Middle East except Israel. They don't have the same the Arab countries don't have the same security concerns that Israel has with respect to privacy, with respect to control over their telecoms. For us, it's existential. For the Arabs, it's just another thing. So they also believe that they can balance the two, balance the U.S. off of China and vice versa. We've seen very clearly Saudi Arabia and UAE's ability to get benefits from both sides, and especially Saudi Arabia playing one off the other quite successfully, because Saudi Arabia has a lot to offer. It has a lot of money and oil resources. So it's in a very different position. Uh, and having Saudi Arabia in China's camp is a major goal. Pulling it away from the US is an anchor for China's position here. When Xi Jinping came out with the Global Security Initiative, Wang Yi, the top diplomatic official of the country, said this will become the security architecture of the Middle East. Specifically said that. Now, prior to COVID, there were yearly gatherings hosted by China between Israelis and Palestinians, talks, but they were all with non-official players, which didn't really lead to much, except China got a little bit of pro propaganda that they were helping the Palestinian cause. Well, late, they after the success with the Saudi-Iran rapprochement, where they invested a few months of effort, where the Qataris and maybe it was Oman, who had done the heavy lifting along with Iraq. But China came in towards the end, definitely made a contribution. And that success far outweighed their expectations. They did not realize that they were going to get so much play from that achievement. And it led them to pick up the phone for the first time ever to have the foreign minister back then, before when Qin Gang was still in his role, called up the Israeli foreign minister and the foreign minister of the Palestinian Authority and said, we're happy to mediate and bring this problem into the United Nations. And of course, it's well known that Israel is despised in the United Nations, never gets a fair shake, and bringing anything about Israel into the United Nations is anathema for Israel and equal to failure. Nonetheless, China made that offer. I think China's interest is establishing the Global Security Initiative, which is also a non-starter for Israel, with the concept of indivisible security, where the security needs are equated for us between the Palestinians and the Israelis. It doesn't speak to the problem where we are the subject of Palestinian terror on a permanent, ongoing basis. Yes, the media in China portrays it as Israel being the aggressor, but in fact, we are the victims of terror over and over and over. And the reason we have to have all of these checkpoints, et cetera, is because we keep getting blown up. So, how my understanding of the end game here right now, China on the one hand has its goals. It wants to sideline the U.S., keep Saudi Arabia in its orbit, strengthen the uh, axis of countries that are under the sort of China umbrella of quote global South countries, and have some of these stronger countries like Saudi Arabia in that camp. However, after this terrible failure on the part of Israel, and there are reasons, there are many reasons unknown, but there are a couple of reasons that are known, and they're not good. One of the reasons I think that Israel let down its guard is because Hamas had been behaving incrementally more like a responsible actor. And Israel wanted to believe the fantasy, like everyone else, that there's hope for, for peace, hope for progress, and let down its guard. And that, along with the infighting that we had over the last 9 months, distracted too many people. And for that, and as well as other reasons that will come out later, uh, we were, we dropped the ball. Our security people dropped the ball. And that's over. Israel has regrouped. We are now We and the rest of the world are now aware of who we are dealing with. And there is no possibility when you live next to a monster, you have two choices. The monster eats you or you kill it. And those are it's a terrible thing, but you can't live next to a monster who's constantly coming and trying to destroy you. So that will happen. And if Hezbollah decides to join in, I don't know. When the U.S. battleship pulled into the Mediterranean, it was a very strong message, not only to Hezbollah of what they might expect, because Americans were killed and Americans were probably kidnapped and taken hostage, which gives America the ability to get involved should that be useful. But it also speaks to Saudi Arabia and the other countries of the region that if you're like Israel or you are working with Israel, you have an opportunity to gain the kind of security umbrella that Israel has. And that, in my opinion, you want to talk about where is the Middle East going. I see a new Middle East that none of us could have predicted on its way, where we have this war. We reshape the immediate neighborhood based on the results of that war, that normalization follows with Saudi Arabia, that other Arab countries see the benefits and join in. And at that point, China will have to rethink its approach to Israel, because until now, Israel was a very useful card. If you throw Israel under the bus, and China doesn't like to hear it, but it's the truth. If you throw Israel under the bus, the idea was you're going to get support of the 56 Muslim states and certainly the 22 in the Arab League. And if many countries in the Arab League are normalized with Israel, working with Israel, changing their views of Israel, you can't do that anymore. Now you're going to have to work with Israel to gain the support of those countries. And that, in turn, throws a bit of a stick in the spokes of the Iran-China relationship.
Anything you want to leave our Chinese, American, European, global listenership with?
Yeah, I do want to mention that one aspect of this conflict that is not being mentioned, but is an underlying critical factor, is the civil war within Islam that is basically Iran versus Saudi Arabia, Sunni versus Shia, where Iran is looking to establish an Islamist, uh, more extremist leadership and take the global Muslim population into a more extremist direction. And Saudi Arabia and Morocco are working towards a more moderate Islam. And this is being played out right now. We're in the crosshairs as usual. We, Israel, we're on the front lines. And how this ends up is going to impact many, many parts of the world. And I think people need to be aware and support Israel's efforts, not only because we were butchered, but also because we're on the front lines, working for a world order of stability and of moderation that I think is desired by most countries.
Carice, thanks for being a part of China Talk.
It was a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Ophir Dayan works at the Institute for National Security Studies based in Tel Aviv. She's a China Middle East policy analyst, also recording this the AM Eastern Time, Tuesday, October 10th. Ophir, talk us through your past few days.
So, if I had to choose one word to describe what Israel and Israelis have been experiencing over the last three and a little more than 3 days, is surreal. I think that things that unfolded on the ground are scenarios that Israelis didn't think possible. It's in a way the worst nightmare of Israelis. I think the past three days were for Israelis a wake up call. We've seen hundreds, almost 1,000 Israelis killed. We've seen, I assume, what to be over 100 Israelis, including civilians and children and the elderly, kidnapped into Gaza. I think it's important to understand how sure Israel was in the strength of its army and in the weakness of Hamas in comparison, and how there is a misconception. There was a huge misconception about the power balance here, and I think many Israelis, including myself, um, are even now, more than 3 days after this war broke, a bit in disbelief of what's been happening. And again, I'm gonna use the word surreal. We've seen sites. They're very graphic, so I'm not going to repeat them here. But we never thought we're gonna see this sort of fighting taking place inside Israel. We never thought we'd see the sheer number of people kidnapped and murdered by Hamas. And I'm going to say one more thing, which I think it's very important to understand here. We've seen ISIS-styled acts by Hamas, and I think that also is a very important aspect in terms of, first of all, the people killed and abused, but also the psych, the national psych. I think that it adds to the shock and trauma that we've been experiencing, and since it's taken place in 2023, everything is recorded, everything is on social media, and people are exposed to it. And lastly, I'm going to say that only the sheer number of people missing, the people murdered, means that every single Israeli knows at least one, if not more, um, of someone who is directly impacted by the fighting, whether it be a murdered individual, a hostage being held in Gaza, someone missing, um, and I think that's it's a big turning point for Israeli society and for myself in how we view ourselves and our enemies in this region, both in terms of their strength and in terms of their um, brutality.
Ophir, well, let's tease that out a little bit. What's the sort of before and after? I mean, it is a terrorist organization. They have been bombing Israelis for a long time now. But sort of what about the kind of ISIS, inspired dimension, as well as the scale, sort of changes, how the government and how the people sort of interpret their, I don't know, the broader security environment.
So I'm gonna say something that's it's gonna be very sad, but for the past 18 years, Israelis got used to being bombarded by Hamas, by rockets, by water shells. We just got used to it, and it's no longer something that is completely shocking or destabilizing to us. We are used to having this mini conflict with Hamas once every few years. But this one is different. I think what makes it different is the surprise. Um, we woke up Saturday morning, 6:30 a.m. Israel time, with uncertainty of what's even happening on Israeli territory. Um, Entire communities were held by Hamas. They were taken over by a terrorist organization. And this surprise of something we never thought possible, and the way that it took the Israeli Defense Forces and the police many, many hours to intervene, I think that's different from other times. Um, but I think what makes it very different than other times, which is, I think, the most destabilizing thing, is that we are used to, I don't want to say sterile warfare, but to bombs and aircraft. In response, we're not used to them infiltrating Israeli territory in this scale, taking more than 100 Israelis, civilians, hostages, and killing almost 1,000 Israelis.
Uh, what's your sense of the sort of um, Ophir, why don't you give a little background of China-Israel relations, as well as uh, what China has been pursuing over the past few years in the broader Middle East?
Okay, so I'm gonna start this way. Diplomatic relations between China and Israel has only been a thing since the 90s. So even the broader context of Israeli-China relations is pretty recent in terms of international relations. The relationship between China and Israel is based a lot on economic um, and trade relations. Uh, China is viewed here in Israel as an economic partner, not as a strategic partner in the same way the US is perceived here in Israel. Um, Yet, I'm going to say it this way, look, even though China is perceived here as a trade partner more than a strategic one, people here like China. They value China. People here travel to China. They buy Chinese products. Before this entire thing started, we even were talking about a planned trip by the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to China, a trip that stirred controversy because Netanyahu and his closest compatriots even floated around this idea of China, of this trip being a realignment um, in the Israeli alliances system, a little more towards China than the U.S. And we need to understand the context that this is coming from. People view China very differently than people in the U.S. view China. Well, people in the U.S. view China as competition, as a threat. In Israel, China is an inspiration. We look at how, China builds magnificent structures and huge projects. And here in Israel as well, by the way. So that's how Israelis view China. And I think in this context, it was very disappointing for many Israelis to see the Chinese response, especially compared to the American response and to other Western nations. While President Joe Biden unequivocally supports Israel, gave several statements, is sending, Navy vessels here, sending military assistance. China couldn't even bring itself to properly denounce Hamas. Something that is very basic. And even people as anti-Israel as Ilhan Omar, the Congress member for the U.S., she even condemned Hamas more than China, and no Israeli thought that Ilhan Omar would be a better ally of Israel than China. I think that's a bit surreal to see Ilhan Omar saying that she's horrified by the crimes Hamas is committing, and China saying they hope for all sides to remain calm. I think that's a bit surreal for us. Um, this entire idea is magnified by the fact that there is a Chinese citizen, at least one, directly affected by the fighting. And a citizen called Noah. She's a young Israeli, Chinese Israeli, being held in Gaza. Her mom is Chinese. Um, and there was a very viral video of her being kidnapped into Gaza. She has been kidnapped by Hamas, and first of all, if I might say, she's a very beautiful young lady. Which when you look at it, it's just sad. She's there surrounded by Hamas terrorists, and she's saying, "Please don't kill me." And it's been on the cover on of many international news outlets, many newspapers, and China, where she's a citizen, has been their response was rather disappointing.
So I'm sorry. I think is it we know her mother is a citizen. I'm not sure she's like a passport holder. Is that confirmed of here, or what's the dynamic there?
I think as far as the reports here goes, she's a Chinese citizen. Yes.
Um, yeah, I mean it's tricky because like you can't like China doesn't
Yeah,
recognize dual
yeah, yeah.
citizenship,
So
right? So
she's not recognized by China as a citizen because she has dual citizenship.
so
Which again is a concept that is very foreign to Israelis because there are many Israelis with dual citizenship, so they don't understand why, in this case, it's not something that prompts reaction.
gotcha. Oh, Fear, let's take a step back then and talk about you know China's broader ambitions in the Middle East. We saw them being very proud of brokering this, deal between Iran and Saudi Arabia. We'll see where that leaves. We'll see where that ends up after, the dust settles from this war. But, what is the relationship that China particularly has been trying to develop with Iran? How is that seen now following an attack of the magnitude like this?
Look, I must be completely honest with you. I think Israelis are less engaged in the China discussion here in the Middle East. This is something that we people who monitor China very closely. This is something that is very disturbing to us. The average Israeli, I'm not sure even knows or takes account of China's actions here in the Middle East. But I would say though that every interaction between a foreign government and Iran is seen as very negative here in Israel, especially by a government like China, a country that Israelis consider as a friend. I think that while the tension between the US and China is very evident and very understood by analysts here in Israel, the average Israeli is less aware of it. And they view China as, as a friendly country. So it's lack of ability to condemn Hamas properly. And more than that, its alignment with Iran is seen very negatively here. And they will be viewed even more negatively when Israelis will be more aware of this connection.
Um, so if you're, let me read you this tweet. I'm curious for your response. Ryan Haas from Brookings tweeted, "Time will tell, but my expectation is that China's cautious response to Hamas's attack in Israel will expose the limits of PRC influence in the region. Beijing historically has been wary of being drawn into taking sides. I don't expect that to change." Thoughts or response to that sentiment of yours?
I think that's a very good analysis of what's been happening. While the United States is extremely involved in what's happening over the last little more than three days, China is not as involved. Um, Rhetorically by not being able to condemn Hamas like other nations did. But also on the ground, I want to remind our listeners that a few years back, China even proposed to mediate between Israel and the Palestinians. Again, it did the same, I think, last year as well. And those are attempts that Israelis are aware of. They know that China views itself as some sort of a potential mediator in the never-ending Middle Eastern conflict. Even a survey that was conducted a few months ago with young Arabs in the Middle East, showed that they prefer China to the US as a mediator. But in times like this, a country that views itself as a possible mediator, should be more involved and not, sit on the sidelines and say, bad people on both sides. And that's practically what China has been doing so far. I think China is also showing its um, lack of nuance of what's been happening here. The sides here are not even, especially when you ask Israelis. And China kind of makes this comparison. Um, and while the United States is sending military assistance, which is, again, very, very unusual, it also shows solidarity on other levels. The White House was colored blue and white as the Eiffel Tower and the Brandenburg Gate in Germany. We don't see that solidarity from China. Um, but I think it's important to understand how, Europeans and Americans are also very familiar to Israelis. They travel here. And although there are many Chinese tourists in Israel, Israelis know less about Chinese culture. They know less Chinese individuals. So even on the human level and on social media, they interact less with Chinese people than they interact with Americans or with Europeans and other English speaking countries. So, so China is, I would say, cautiously unfelt here by Israelis, and I would even say by Israeli leadership.
Yeah. Um, there's sort of the context, I guess, of like ISIS style exposure, I think, which China and the Chinese, people as well as Chinese leadership really hasn't had. I mean, in terms of terrorist attacks, right? We've had some knife stuff and a threatened car bomb, which has kind of been it over the past 15 years. And I think that's very different than, um, in European, bombings and killings across Europe as well as in the US and in the Middle East where America had troops in Iraq and Afghanistan for years and years. So I think there's sort of uh the 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 comparisons are maybe easier to draw given the proximity of sort of similar experience, I guess, of
And I think it's important also to note that in terms of values, there is more similarity between the values on which Israel is built upon and American and Western values. It's easier for democratic countries like the U.S. and the U.K. understand how it is um, felt by Israelis when a non-democratic society is in conflict with a democratic society, which is something that is not shared by China.
What's a kind of interesting parallel that was pointed out by your colleague Tuvia Gehring, who couldn't join us today because he was called up, is the sort of echo that you're seeing in China's response to the Russia-Ukraine fight and the way it's portrayed on official media to how they're talking about Hamas's attacks and Israel's response, where you basically have this narrative of like the devastation caused in this case by over the past year by Ukraine, in this case by Israel. Sort of no real context on like why those things are happening. And then one or two sort of nods, or maybe not even a nod. It was sort of incredible, I thought, in Siwen Lianbo, how they didn't even mention the fact that hundreds of Israelis civilians were killed, which is why you saw the images in the first half of the sort of little clip of attacks in Gaza happening in the first place, and then you kind of close it with a, by the way, this is actually all America's fault because they're the bad actors. So it is sort of like a surreal playbook to I mean, to it's surreal, but, like, I guess kind of understandable given that she has this relationship with Putin and sees them as a strategic ally, but to sort of, in a sense, put Putin's a superpower or sort of superpower in Russia on the same level as Hamas, is just a wild thing to see happening in real time.
Yeah, definitely. I definitely agree with that.
Ophir, thanks for being a part of China Talk.
Thank you very much, Jordan. And hope for better, quiet, peaceful days.
אני אלוף העולם בלהדחיק כל מה שמפחיד אותי, כל מה שמלחיץ אני משתיק.
אני אלוף העולם בלאהוב קודם את עצמי, אחר כך בבמה וברחוב הכי קשה לתת למישהו קרוב. אני אלוף העולם בלא להיות, בלא לפתור לך את הבעיות.
אפילו התמונות שבקירות, זה לא אני תליתי, אני אחראי רק על המנגינות.
אני אלוף העולם בליפול ולקום כמו גדול אדירי כמו חול. אני נשרף אבל בוחר בכל יום להמשיך לחיות. אני אלוף העולם בלרצות לפחות לנסות. את תראי איך בסוף אחרי ההפסדים הניצחון הרבה יותר מתוק. אני אלוף העולם.
אני אלוף העולם בלהצדיק
חולשות ותאוות היצר הוא מכר ותיק, מכיר כל טריק עתיק שהוא מחזיק בתיק.
אבל תראי, יום אחד אהיה צדיק, עמוק בפנים כל מה שיש לי לא מספיק. בעליל אני עכבר קטן והחיים חליל.
נופל הבור כי לא מצליח להבדיל בין טוב לרע ולאן כל זה מוביל. את משדרת עסקים כרגיל,
אבל תכף ייגמר לנו הפתיל.
אני אלוף העולם בליפול ולקום כמו גדול אדירי כמו חול. אני נשרף אבל בוחר בכל יום להמשיך לחיות.
אני אלוף העולם בלרצות לפחות לנסות.
את תראי איך בסוף אחרי ההפסדים הניצחון הרבה יותר מתוק. אני אלוף העולם